It was a typical Sunday in 1875 as people walked down the busy streets of Boston. The Warren Avenue Baptist Church had just finished up the children's Sunday school when suddenly a horrific blood-curdling scream rang through the air. And it turns out that that scream was coming from inside the church. Hey everyone, welcome back. My name is Summer Sanchez, and on this channel we talk about crime, cults, and heinous history. And today we're going back to the 1800s, and we're going to be talking about a case that you probably have never heard of. This case is referred to often as the Boston Belfry murders. This is another one of those shorter cases that I just happened to come across when I was looking through old newspaper articles, and I found it super interesting. I do have another video going live in just a couple of days. It's a longer, more recent case, and it's insane, so be watching out for that. And now before we get into this story, let's go ahead and briefly talk about today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Trade. With summer finally coming to an end, I'm starting to slowly get back into my regular morning routine, and my favorite part of that routine is having my morning cup of coffee. And Trade keeps me stocked with freshly roasted coffee from small independent roasters from all over the country. Trade is the #1 coffee destination in the US for both hot and cold coffee drinkers. They've sourced the best beans from over 50 top roasters across the country. Everything is roasted to order, and you can take their quiz, and in under a minute, they'll have a recommendation just for you. And if that first bag isn't quite right, that's no problem because Trade will just replace it for free. They offer tons of different types and brands of coffee. They have espressos, blends, single origin coffees. They have whole bean or ground. And I've personally been talking a lot about their cold brew lately. Trade has teamed up with 15 roasters to create a special collection of coffees made just for cold brew. And they even offer the equipment that you'll need to make cold brew at home. And the cold brew that I've been making at home is so good, and I love that I don't have to run out to a coffee shop in order to get an iced coffee. I can just make it at home. No matter what your preference is, Trade has something for everyone. Trade's prices are comparable to grocery store prices, but the coffee that you get with Trade is just better. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you've definitely heard me talk about Trade a lot, and you know that I love this service. Having a service like Trade that allows me to try out so many unique flavors and brands is a coffee lover's dream. And right now is the perfect time to give Trade a try because they're offering 50% off a 1-month trial. Just go to drinktrade.com/summer to take advantage of this discount. That's drinktrade.com/summer to get 50% off a 1-month trial. A huge thank you to Trade for the continued support on this channel, and now let's get into the case. It was around 10 p.m. on December 5th, 1873, and Bridget Landrigan was making the short walk home from the Highland District in Boston, where she'd been visiting with some friends. Bridget was in her early 20s, and she was originally from Ireland. She had sailed to America a few years earlier, and she started building her life in Boston. She got a job working as a domestic servant for a local family called the Barry family, and even though Bridget's life was, pretty mundane, and she was relatively new to the area, she became pretty popular around Boston, especially with the men. Bridget was said to be extremely beautiful. It was said that she really stood out from the crowd, and she was always being pursued by multiple men at a time, and she broke a lot of hearts. And that night in December of 1873, as Bridget was walking home alone, she didn't notice that there was a man lurking in the shadows behind her. Wherever Bridget walked, the man followed not far behind, and he was slowly getting closer and closer. Once the man was confident that it was just the two of them on the street, he approached Bridget from behind, taking her by surprise, and without saying a word, he attacked her. Now, even though the streets were completely empty at this time, there were still a few people inside some of the nearby shops, and they could hear Bridget screaming, and so they ran outside to see what was happening. And what they saw was a nicely dressed man in a cape and a tall silk hat bent over a woman who was laid out on the ground. As soon as the man heard the people coming, he got up and he took off. He jumped over a stone barrier and he ran in the direction of some nearby train tracks, and he disappeared into the night. The people immediately ran over to help Bridget, but unfortunately she was beyond saving by that point. She was completely drenched in blood. They could see that she had been very badly beaten on her head. At first, Bridget was attempting to speak, but no words were coming out, and then she suddenly had a seizure and she passed away. An officer was called to the scene, and he started interviewing the witnesses, and they all said the same thing, that they saw a man who looked to be about 25 years old. He was dressed in a cape and a tall hat, and they saw him kneeling over Bridget's body. He got startled when they came out, and he took off and ran towards the train tracks. But one of the witnesses did notice something that the others hadn't. He said that he had watched the killer run away for a while, and he noticed that the killer kept having to stop to catch his breath. He would run for a bit, and then he'd have to stop for a few seconds to catch his breath. which seemed odd because, like they told police, he didn't look like an older, out of shape person. He looked pretty young. So police take down all of this information and they start investigating. And they knew that Bridget had a lot of men in her life. Could one of them have done this to her? Detective Albion Dearborn was assigned to the case, and he started interviewing all of the men that Bridget had recently dated, all of the men who had tried to date her. And out of all of the people that they interviewed, there was only one that stood out. His name was Thomas Cahill, and Thomas had been obsessed with Bridget. He had professed his love for her multiple times. He had proposed marriage to her, but Bridget had continuously turned him down. Could this have been a motive to kill her? They also found out that Thomas Cahill worked in the Dorchester area, which is the neighborhood where the attack took place. But what really made detectives focus in on Thomas Cahill was that the morning after the murder, he fled the country. According to his boss, he had sold off some of his possessions and he boarded a ship headed for Ireland. So Detective Dearborn sent word to the authorities in Ireland to let them know that there was a murder suspect getting ready to arrive there in their country, and as soon as he arrived, they needed to take him into custody and then send word to Boston. Meanwhile, Detective Dearborn just continued to investigate other leads, and he found a massive lead that really should have pointed suspicion completely away from Thomas Cahill. During the search of the crime scene, the murder weapon was discovered. They found a long, bloody piece of wood that had been sharpened some at the end, and it was obvious that this piece of wood had been cut from the shaft of a carriage, which are the poles that connect the carriage to the horse. And Detective Dearborn had even managed to track down the exact carriage that the weapon had been cut from. That carriage belonged to the Piper family, and it just so happened that this family lived in the Dorchester area where the murder took place. This was a major finding in the investigation, and so Detective Dearborn went and interviewed all of the members of the Piper family, the mom, the dad, and their adult children. And one of those children was 25-year-old Thomas Piper. Not only did Thomas's age fit the description, but he was also known to occasionally wear a cape and a tall hat. They also found out that Thomas suffered from kidney disease, which Detective Dearborn thought could potentially cause him to get exhausted easily. Remember, the killer kept having to stop running to gasp for breath. However, Thomas denied any involvement. He said that he didn't even know the victim, and he had an alibi for the night of the murder. He was with some of his brothers all night, and they confirmed this story. Not only that, but Thomas's mother told Detective Dearborn that she actually saw Thomas Cahill cutting the shaft off of their carriage the night of the murder. I know it's probably getting confusing with two Thomases. I'm just going to refer to Thomas Cahill as Cahill for the rest of the video. So with no strong evidence against Thomas Piper, the police ended their investigation into him and they refocused their attention fully back on to Cahill. Cahill was apprehended in Ireland and he was shipped back to America in chains. And once he was back, detectives attempted to get one of the witnesses to ID him. They brought in the witnesses that had, been there the night that Bridget was murdered. They had Cahill kneel down the way that they had seen the killer kneeling over the body. They also had him run around to see if the way he ran looked familiar. And if they had him running around, they would have also been looking to see if he had to stop and catch his breath like the killer was seen doing that night. But that didn't happen. And none of those witnesses could identify him as the killer. But he was still charged with the murder of Bridget and he was thrown in jail to await trial. I think that police were just desperate to pin this murder on someone because people were totally outraged by Bridget's death and they were demanding answers. Also, they had made this really big scene out of having him arrested in Ireland and then shipped back to America in chains. So I think that they really, really wanted Cahill to be the killer. And he did remain in prison for the next 10 months awaiting trial, but that trial never came. Police finally had to release him due to lack of evidence. They could not build a case against him. But Cahill's reputation was completely tarnished because of this. For almost a year, everyone thought that he was a murderer, but he wasn't. The real killer was still running loose, and he would go on to brutally attack at least 2 more people. A woman known around Boston as Mary Tynan, her real name was Marie Thomas, but she went by Mary Tynan, she was found bludgeoned and clinging to life in her home in 1874. Mary had met a man in the bar the night before. They got to talking, he bought her some drinks, and they went back to her place. At some point in the middle of the night, as Mary was sleeping, the man used a hammer to bash her head in, and then he fled the scene. Mary did survive that attack, which is crazy because she had sustained extremely severe wounds to her head. Her injuries were so bad that initially police thought that she had been attacked with an axe. And they were really hoping that Mary would be able to identify her attacker, but unfortunately she couldn't remember anything. Her boyfriend was initially arrested, but he was also released when police couldn't find any substantial evidence against him. And I wish that I had happier news regarding Mary's life after she managed to beat the odds and survive her ordeal, but that's not the case. Mary had so many mental health issues after the attack. She never fully recovered mentally. She ended up in a psychiatric hospital and she died there a year later. Then in 1875, the killer struck again, and this time he attacked a 5-year-old child. On May 23rd, 1875, 5-year-old Mabel Young and her classmates were dismissed from Sunday school at Warren Avenue Baptist Church. One by one, the children were picked up by their parents, and at around 3 in the afternoon, Mabel's aunt Augusta Hobbs arrived to pick her up. Augusta went inside the church, she grabbed Mabel by the hand, and they started making their way out of the church when a friend stopped Augusta for a quick chat. While the adults were talking, Mabel let go of her aunt's hand and she wandered off. And this is the point where Mabel's story takes a very disturbing turn. Mabel's aunt Augusta finally finished up her conversation with her friend, and she realized that Mabel was gone, and she immediately started to panic. She started running through the church, asking anyone she could find if they had seen Mabel. And one of the Sunday school teachers said that she had seen Mabel. She had come into her room a little bit earlier to ask if she could borrow a book. Mabel grabbed the book and she walked out of the classroom, and that was the last time anyone saw Mabel before she disappeared. And then suddenly they heard a blood-curdling scream, and it sounded like it was coming from the belfry, which is the part of a bell tower that houses the bells. And Augusta knew that that was Mabel's voice. She was the one screaming. So Augusta, along with the group of people who had been helping her in the search, they all ran towards the door that led up to the bell tower, but it was locked. So they ran off to find the sexton of the church because they knew that he would have the keys to the bell tower. A sexton is a person who tends to various areas of a church. They tend to like the church cemetery, if there is one. They also typically are in charge of ringing and maintaining church bells. So they went and tracked down the sexton, who was in a different part of the church at that time, and they're frantically telling him, like, we need you to come unlock the door to the bell tower. There is a little girl up there. You have to hurry. And from the jump, this sexton was acting very suspiciously. First of all, he told them that he didn't have the key, which was like the first red flag because he had this giant ring of keys, but somehow he doesn't have the one that they needed. He was in charge of taking care of the church bells, so why would he not have that key? And he also kept repeating, she's not up there. She can't be up there. That door's been locked since last winter. There's no way she's up there. And keep in mind, they can hear Mabel screaming from the belfry. They know she's up there. It's not a question at this point. So the crowd of people are getting angry and they're desperate, and the sexton wasn't being any help. He went and searched for the keys, but he came back and said that he couldn't find them. So they decided that they're just going to break down the door, which I think they should have done from the start, but so they broke down the first door, which led to a long staircase. And as soon as they breached the door, they could see that there was blood on the floor. It was like this little puddle of blood, and it was hidden under a newspaper. Of course, this is not a good sign. So they just kept going. They went up the stairs until they came to a second door, which was also locked, but they quickly broke through that door as well. And then that door led to a ladder. So they climbed the ladder, and there she was. 5-year-old Mabel Young, laying on the floor, covered in blood and barely clinging to life. Mabel's injuries were very similar to Bridget's and Mary's. She had been brutally beaten over the head with a blunt object. They grabbed Mabel up and they rushed her to a nearby house to see if anything could be done to save her. Meanwhile, police were called to the scene, and everyone unanimously said that the sexton needed to be questioned because he was acting super weird. And imagine the detective's shock when they found out who the sexton was. It was none other than Thomas Piper, the same man that they had briefly suspected in the murder of Bridget Landrigan 2 years earlier. And everything pointed to Thomas Piper being the person who had attacked Mabel. First of all, Thomas's big ring of church keys were confiscated, and detectives went one by one testing each key out on the doorknob that led to the bell tower. Remember the keys that he claimed he didn't have? And guess what? He did have those keys. They were on the key ring the whole time. The detective found the one that fit, and so he had been lying to the people who were searching for Mabel. They also found out that he was lying when he said that he hadn't been in the belfry all winter long. Multiple people from the church said that they had been up there with Thomas Piper within the last few months. But perhaps the most damning information came from the parents of some other children who attended the same Sunday school as Mabel. Not long before Mabel was attacked, Thomas Piper had attempted to lure a young girl named Florence Leland up to the bell tower, but this child had not taken the bait. Florence went and told her parents about what happened, and they alerted the church, but nothing was done. And it turns out that several children had told their parents that Thomas Piper creeped them out and they were scared of him. Those concerns were expressed to the church, but again, nothing was done. Some other parishioners later came forward and said that they saw Thomas talking to Mabel in the days leading up to the attack. They also said that they saw him weirdly staring at her during church services, and they thought it was very creepy. And remember that puddle of blood on the first level of the staircase that was covered by a newspaper? Well, police later discovered a loose floorboard in that area, and under that floorboard, Thomas had been hiding the murder weapon there, which ended up being a baseball bat. And tragically, Mabel Young did not make it. She fought really hard for about 24 hours, but in the end, she passed away. This was one of the most devastating murders Boston had ever experienced, and people wanted Thomas Piper to pay for what he had done. But the first trial actually ended in a hung jury. 9 people thought that he was guilty, and 3 people weren't so sure. So it was back to the drawing board for the prosecution and back to a prison cell for Thomas Piper. And once Thomas was back in his cell, he attempted to take his own life by slitting his wrists. But some guards noticed and they managed to save him before he bled out. Thankfully, the second trial ended with a guilty verdict, and Thomas was sentenced to death by hanging. And as Thomas's execution date approached, he decided that he had nothing left to lose, and he made a full confession. He said that this was not a spur of the moment thing. He had been having the urge to kill in the days leading up to Mabel's murder. He didn't know who it would be, but he knew that he wanted to kill someone. He stashed a bat under the floorboard behind that first door leading up to the bell tower, and he also admitted that he had tried to lure other children up to the belfry a few weeks before Mabel was killed, but it didn't work out. When he spotted Mabel wandering around the church alone that day, he tried again, and unfortunately this time he was able to lure her up there with the promise of seeing pigeons. Once he got her up to the top of the tower, he attacked her with the bat. Some sources say that he attempted to sexually assault her once he thought that she was dead, but I haven't been able to confirm those details. But I do know that Thomas did think that Mabel was dead, but she suddenly started screaming. This startled him, and so he jumped out of one of the tower windows, and then he went around the church and back through the front doors, hoping that if he just acted normal, no one would suspect him of anything. But of course we know he did not act normal. He was being really weird, and he immediately aroused suspicion. And then he went on to confess to 2 more attacks: the murder of Bridget Landrigan and the attempted murder of Mary Tynan. The night that Bridget was murdered, Thomas had been hanging out with his brothers. That part of his story was true. But at some point that night, they split up. Thomas, apparently feeling the urge to kill, went home and sawed off the shaft of the family's carriage, and then he hid it under their fence. He then met back up with his brothers for a bit, and this is when he spotted Bridget walking home all alone, and he decided that she would be the perfect victim. He immediately told his brothers that he needed to go home and go to bed, but he actually went home, got his weapon, and then he set off in the direction where he had seen Bridget walking. He lurked behind her for a while until he was confident that they were all alone on the street and no one would see what was about to happen. And then he beat her with the carriage shaft. Bridget's screams alerted the people in the shops, and then he took off towards the train tracks. In Mary Tynan's case, Thomas said that he had met her in a bar, and he went back to her place, and they both fell asleep in her bed. He said he woke up at around 3 a.m. He saw a hammer sitting on her nightstand. He grabbed it, and he beat her in the head with it, and then he jumped out of her window, assuming that she was dead. No one really knows what triggered this murderous rage in Thomas. Some people think that it had something to do with his kidney disease. To help with the pain, he would often mix whiskey with opium, and some of the parishioners said that they caught him drinking that during church services. And he claimed that he had been drinking this concoction before each of the attacks. So it's thought that maybe this mixture of opium and whiskey caused him to become violent. Unfortunately, we'll never know, but on May 26, 1876, Thomas Piper was sent to the gallows. He was hanged to death in front of a large crowd of 400 people. Thomas Cahill was later awarded a $1,000 settlement for his wrongful conviction. It came out that police had way more evidence on Thomas Piper than they ever did on Cahill in the murder of Bridget, including literally tracing the murder weapon, the only real piece of physical evidence, back to the Piper family, but yet they still focused all of their attention on trying to pin the murder on him. He got his settlement and he sailed back to Ireland, which, by the way, his family lived in Ireland, so it's not like he had no reason to go there. The police made it sound like he had fled the country to escape prosecution, and I couldn't confirm if this was true or not, but one source said that Thomas Cahill was actually murdered not long after he moved back to Ireland. There were a couple of other murders that Thomas Piper was suspected of, but there was never enough evidence to convict him. And that is all I have on this case. Let me know what you guys think about this one down in the comments. Don't forget to go to drinktrade.com/summer or click the link in the description box to get 50% off a 1-month trial. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and leaving me a comment. That is the easiest way for you to support me and my channel. And again, I will have a longer video going out in just a couple of days, so be on the lookout for that. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.